Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it has been a week. In my newsletter on Sunday, I wrote about last Thursday's oncology check-in, where despite my anxiety and burned out state from the last couple of months, my white blood cell count numbers were just fine. I do not need to consider starting treatment for my leukemia, so yay me. I was a little not worried this time. I was just ready for news one way or the other. And anyway, that went fine, though. I'm not going to go into it since I already wrote all about it. I also wrote about carting out a ton of books from my house during the week for our local library's book sale. The whole culling process felt really good, and it was kind of beneficial to do that during the lead up to the oncology appointment, since I was already in a mortality mindset, and I'll never get around to reading or rereading this vibe was pretty strong. But that was last week. After Thursday, I'm a new man for another 4 months till the next check-in. I got to celebrate by recording this week's show that you're about to hear on Saturday, and then doing 2 more in New York City on Sunday. That involved traveling to one of those fantastic courtyard buildings in the Upper West Side, like where Only Murders in the Building takes place. Not the same one. And then going down to the Lower East Side from there for the two of them were interesting contrasts and conversations, but yeah, I get my kicks in weird ways. I got to admit it. Anyway, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is Doug Broad, who has this awesome new biography out, Born with a Tale, The Devilish Life and Wicked Times of Anton Szandor LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan. It's from Hachette, and even though I've got a couple of other episodes already recorded, I thought this one would fit, what with October being, spooky season and all that. LaVey was known for, the tall, shaved head, goatee, Ming the Merciless look with the cloak with the hooded, the horned cape, the horned hood and all that stuff. And anyway, had a whole Satan vibe that was part of the showmanship that he brought to being the founder of the Church of Satan. And anyway, let me get at this. LaVey founded the Church of Satan back in the mid-'60s in San Francisco. And the way Doug portrays it in the book, it's sort of a rebellion against the false piety of organized religion. And LaVey managed to build this following of people who were searching for something different, this being the mid to late 60s, and New Age is coming on, and people were looking for, self-empowerment and other ways of changing their lives and getting out of the establishment as we know it. And he, like I said, was a real showman, and he managed to get these disaffected and hip and sort of New Age people together into this church of sorts, where there wasn't a initiation type ritual thing, but Doug explores the history of the church in the book, so I don't want to give away too much about what it was, and we talk in the conversation about it too. But we'll say, I'll put it this way. Doug goes into LaVey's upbringing in the book and the mythology he built around himself and the evolution of the church and the people and the celebrities who either participated or at least interacted with it, and how LaVey's whole philosophy of indulgence and creativity and self-deification kind of changed American culture. On top of that, there's the visual, proto-goth aspect of it all. We make a Addams Family reference in our conversation about this. And he really did live in this sort of self-built haunted house in San Francisco with all sorts of artifacts and tricks. And at one point, a full-grown lion and all sorts of other stuff. Trapdoors and secret compartments and things along those lines. Anyway, I'll put it this way. Born with a Tale is an enormously fun book to read, even when things get dark. Like in the 80s, when the satanic panic phenomenon happens and LaVey's church gets dragged into these made-up atrocities that were not happening to these little kids. And throughout the book, Doug brings a very conversational voice to the page. And he does it while still being rigorous with the writing, with the reportage, with the records that he checks out and the extensive interviews that he did, as well as the, I imagine, clips and interviews from the past that he incorporates into the book. And he really brings us LaVey's myths and reality. And he shows us how they affected people. And the interesting thing to me, and this comes up in the conversation from when Doug himself discovered LaVey in the late 80s and when I came across him in the 90s, that post-punk era where LaVey gained a new life, where a new generation kind of discovered his philosophy, and it didn't have the immediate alienness that it had in the 60s and 70s when the church was becoming a thing, but how it was incorporated into their lives in really interesting ways. So Doug comes from an entertainment writing background, so the sections on the Hollywood interactions that I referred to earlier with LaVey and the church, those are particularly fun. They're well reported. They're full of great showbiz meets Satanists anecdotes. But the book throughout, it brings you this guy's life, and it brings you a sense of why a man felt compelled to build the Church of Satan, and whether or not it was, I don't want to say a scam, but whether it was something he believed or something he performed long enough that it became second nature. I enjoyed the heck out of Born with a Tale. And again, during the conversation, I go into some of why that is. But I want to harken back, and I do it during the show too, to an episode I did with Joe Coleman a few months ago, where it hit me that certain people can bring a different world into ours. Whether it's, I don't know what the mix of elements truly is. There's will, there is commitment. There has to be an aesthetic vision that guides that. And Joe Coleman has that, and LaVey did in his way too. Presumably there are other factors that don't involve selling one's soul or anything like that, and that's not what the Church of Satan's about. It's a dumb joke. But yeah, there's that sense that these guys were related in that respect. These are people who built something that meant something that kind of intersects with the day-to-day world the rest of us live in. Anyway, go get Born with a Tale. It is an illuminating read about an occult figure. LaVey hated the occultist, so I'm using occult in the difficult to see / concealed meaning of the word. But it's really an awfully good book. And I think you will find that the life of LaVey kind of resonates with you, regardless of your religious affiliation or affinities. You may find it really interesting and compelling to see someone who reinvents themselves and invents a new world around them that draws other people into it. Anyway, as caveats go, we did this one remotely. There was a weird latency glitch that cropped up about 18 minutes in, and we had to stop and reconnect. The audio is a little different on his side after that. I will let you know when it happens. Oh, and I want to thank Dean Haspiel for connecting us. He wrote to let me know this book was coming out, and he figured Doug and I would have a great time together, and he was right. So thank you, Dino. Now here's Doug's bio. Doug Broad is the former editor-in-chief of Spin and TV Guide magazines and the author of They Just Seem a Little Weird, How Kiss, Cheap Trick, Aerosmith, and Stars Remade Rock and Roll. That's also from Hachette. He's also been an editor at Entertainment Weekly and Condé Nast and has written for the New York Times, Billboard, The Hollywood Reporter, and Fangoria. A native New Yorker, he lives with his family in Toronto, where he is an editor at the Toronto Star. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Doug Broad. Tell me about the origins of Born with a Tale and your LaVey.
Well, I wrote a book a few years ago about 70s hard rock, and I wanted to, it's called They Just Seem a Little Weird, and I wanted to follow it up with something. I wanted to write another book, and I had a number of ideas. The one that clicked with my editor was this story of Anton LaVey. He's a guy, he founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco in 1966. And I didn't really know about him until the late 80s. He'd been around in the culture, especially in the late 60s, early 70s. He was pretty well known. But it wasn't until the late 80s when he kind of began cropping up in all of these punk zines, in interviews and profiles that I kind of sort of discovered him. Sure. And I became kind of obsessed with him because, I mean, just his look kind of was interesting. He's bald with this, with a goatee and an earring, and he had very piercing eyes, and he was a very kind of satanic looking guy. But I also was pretty, I was interested in what he had to say. I mean, here's a guy whose philosophy was pretty, I mean, it was indulgent. It was do what you want to do, as long as you're not hurting anybody else. Man should indulge in all of his carnal instincts and not feel guilty, so long as you're not bothering anybody else. And he was really funny. So he had this kind of dark philosophy, dark, indulgent, selfish, greedy philosophy, but he was very funny in the interviews. And then I started reading his books, and he's really funny in his books as well, while also, having quite a nasty streak. And I had read two biographies about him, one of which was written in 1974 by a member of the church and a journalist, this guy Burton Wolfe. And he subsequently said that a lot of what he wrote about LaVey was fed to him by LaVey and were essentially lies and fabrications. Sure. There was another book written that came out around 1990, written by LaVey's longtime companion, a woman named Blanche Barton, which is a really good book, but it's obviously written from, right, one very subjective perspective. And LaVey obviously had a heavy hand in writing that book as well. So I wanted to write about him, but approach him from a journalistic point of view. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years, mostly pop culture, entertainment. And I just wanted to try to get to the real story, to sort of humanize this guy who was seen as this demonic character.
Yeah, to that extent, how much of a challenge was it? The book, you do the reportage, the myth busting, as it were, but you also, incorporate the historic moment around him, the various historic phases, 60s and 70s into the 80s satanic panic, the philosophy, gets integrated into that, especially later in the book. How much of a challenge was it, balancing that sense of, again, the journalistic and then the broader phenomenon that you were trying to get across?
Yeah, I didn't want to write a book that was going to debunk his mythology, right? Because to me that would be a tedious exercise, because so much of it could be perceived as dubious. So much of what he said. I mean, at a certain point, you say, so what if this guy embellished his resume? I mean, so long as he wasn't doing any harm, it's like he was building up a myth like so many other celebrities do in our culture. So I didn't want to be nitpicky and go, fact by fact and debunk it. So, when I was telling the story, there were some obvious, fabrications that he had made up, and I had to call them out. And a number of years ago, I believe it was 1992. Rolling Stone magazine did kind of an expose on LaVey, a profile that included a lot of debunking of his mythology, which Lawrence Wright, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, wrote. He wrote this piece, and I interviewed him for the book, and he was quite candid with me about his time with LaVey. But even in his piece, where he tried to debunk things, he also perpetuated a few of the lies and fabrications that LaVey was purporting. So, I just couldn't. I couldn't get into that mindset of just trashing this guy, because that's not the book I wanted to write, and it wasn't the book I think people would want to read. So there was a fine balance in getting in the mythology, getting in, some correction, some fact checking, and also sort of telling the cultural history about, figuring out why this guy came to prominence, why San Francisco, and how his legacy is still felt today.
Can you talk a little about that? What your first discovery was in terms of, why this did happen and San Francisco of all places?
Well, it was San Francisco during, around the time of the Summer of Loves. Sure. And San Francisco's always been a place that has welcomed alternative lifestyles, alternative culture, alternative figures. So, at that period, 1966, it was kind of ripe for this very charismatic, funny, bizarre character to rise to some kind of prominence. I always say, so, the LaVey started the church in 1966, and it was in an old house, an old Victorian house, with trapdoors and skeletons. And he had the whole sort of bizarre, dark aesthetic. He was a fan of the occult. He was a student of the occult, I should say. He loved film noir. He loved the Universal monster movies. So he was into this really kind of dark, horror adjacent stuff. And, he lived with a full-grown lion in his house or in his backyard. So he was this character, and his whole family kind of, played up this kind of Addams Family or Munsters vibe. And those two shows came out just 2 years before he started the church. So that kind of attitude was in the culture. That kind of aesthetic was in the culture. So they were seen as this kind of real life analog to these sitcom horror families. And that got him a lot of attention. He did this, his first big sort of publicity stunt was the first satanic marriage, which he conducted in his house, in his ritual chamber. And then he went on to do the first satanic baptism of his daughter Xena at 3 years old. So he had these kinds of, I guess you could kind of call them happenings at his home that brought him a lot of attention, a lot of national and international attention. Johnny Carson had him on The Tonight Show. He was on the cover of Look magazine, which was a huge sort of competitor to Life magazine. he appeared on the Steve Allen show twice. And one of those episodes I'm dying to see any of these episodes, but one of the episodes I'm dying to see, he was on with Jack Palance and Charles Nelson Riley.
As you say, 60s and 70s. That's a perfect panel.
Exactly.
So as an aside, Addams Family or Munsters for you?
For me, the Munsters.
Okay. I never know.
I like the Munsters only because it was more. I think when I started watching them in the early 70s, I think it was more that they were more blatantly, Universal monsters, Frankenstein, Dracula. The Addams Family, I think, was a little bit too over my head. Yeah, maybe.
I get you. The Munsters felt like it's more good natured. The Addams Family was flat out weird, which is why it appealed to me. But
exactly, yeah.
So, what was the toughest part of the research for you?
The toughest part of the research was trying to get some people on board who were reluctant to, and who, didn't want to talk, and who didn't talk. So I reached out to all the family members I could find. His two daughters, Carla and Zena, did not want to talk, and they did not talk. I reached out to his final longtime companion, Blanche, who wrote the book, and she actually agreed to an email interview, and she was very frank with me and gave me a lot of, she answered all my questions very candidly and gave me a lot of good stuff to use in the book, and I do use it. One family member that I tried to get, it was just very strange circumstances. So I reached out to LaVey's grandson, Stanton, who I had commissioned a story on when I was the editor of Spin magazine in the early 2000s, and because he was kind of like a mover and shaker on the LA goth music scene. He was at all the clubs and he was doing music on his own, and I thought he'd be a pretty interesting guy to profile. So we were in contact back then, and I reached out to him for the book, and he agreed to be interviewed for it. And we set a date, and I was on the Zoom call, and he never showed up. And I emailed him right away. I said, is something holding you up? Can we reschedule? I'm happy to reschedule. Never heard back. I followed up the next day, never heard back. And then around 2 days later, I get an email from a mutual acquaintance who said, "Did you hear about Stanton?" I said, "No." He said, "Stanton died the other day." And I'm like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, he died on December 14th. And I was like, "Whoa, that was the date of our interview." Yeah. So that was a weird. That chilled me. That was a weird occurrence, during the writing of this book. I'll tell you though, in terms of reaching out to people, I was able to find, and this is part of the joy of writing a book like this, is when you actually find people after doing some investigation, and they're willing to talk to you and they're eager to talk to you. For instance, I reached out to the woman who was the editor of the Satanic Bible, which was his first book, which has gone on to sell over 1 million copies, which kind of shocked me. Yeah. But I found this woman, and she talked to me. She lives in Jersey, and she must be in her 80s. She gave me some great stuff. I also found the guy who edited The Complete Witch, which was his second book. Yeah. And the Complete Witch was kind of, the first book, The Satanic Bible, was, what it says on the cover. It was a Satanic Bible. And, there's a lot of ritual in it, a lot of kind of declamatory, angry, beseeching, and there's also a lot of humor in it. The second book, The Complete Witch, was kind of a guide for women to sort of land the perfect man for them. And it was kind of in the vein of this kind of self-help books that Cosmopolitan was pushing back in those days, and it's really funny. It's very weird, like all his writings. It's very weird, but it's very funny. And the guy who edited the book and bought the book for the publishing house, I found him. He's in New York, and he was just fantastic. I mean, he had a great memory apparently, and he told me and he had a real sense of humor, and his quotes. His name is Thomas Lipscomb, and his quotes in the book are just hysterical.
Oh, they're dynamite. Those ones I felt like you really enjoyed the heck out of hearing from him. Those things just shine in the books.
I did, and he just had so much fun talking with me, because I guess he probably never spoke about this stuff in his entire career. No one's ever asked him. So, that was great. So when you find people like that who really bring something to, the book, you just sort of thank your lucky stars.
Sure. And you did the legwork. I mean, that stuff doesn't happen by accident. You were, you're pursuing this as a journalist for something that, again, people may not have thought of as a subject to tackle. So,
yeah.
How did it change your understanding of both of LaVey as the person and as, you mentioned how important the work was to you, the Satanic Bible and everything when you were younger, or the effect it had. How did making this book kind of make you reevaluate or give you any new perspective on that? And I know as adults, we don't have the same vibe we had about Anton LaVey as when we were young, but, did it cause a sort of reevaluation or look at yourself? A little bit.
I mean, I think it's strange because, like I said, I discovered him kind of late in the late 80s, so I didn't really know much about his history. So I think it was his history that kind of moved me rather than what came later, because I kind of knew what came later. So just reading about the early days and researching his relationship with people like Jane Mansfield and Sammy Davis Jr., reading about his appearances on all of these shows and in mainstream magazines, and then, looking pretty deeply into the whole satanic panic in the 80s when he kind of went into retreat and didn't come out. And he had his daughter Zena go out and defend the church on his behalf. Because, the Church of Satan wasn't a Satan worshiping or devil worshiping church. It was kind of just a self-empowering group that acted out psychodramas to give people confidence.
Okay, here's that break I mentioned. I could have stitched it together, but you'll notice that the audio on the other side of this, it's a little hotter. Okay. So if you could talk about that sort of self-empowering nature of what LaVey's church was into, as opposed to like what some of the other satanic outcroppings have been like, as well as, Est coming up at the same time in San Francisco in the 70s, and sort of what these various movements were like and what differentiated what Anton was up to.
Yeah, so LaVey was very into creativity and artistic endeavors, and he looked at the Church of Satan as something that would, help drive people to be artistic, to be creative, to get financial success. He was into, social science and sociology, and the idea of being the idea of teaching people to be able to manipulate others. He was very into manipulating people, and he felt that he could teach people how to achieve and how to achieve their ends by manipulating others. So that was pretty much what he was pushing. That's what he was selling. A lot of these other organizations, you had Scientology, which was older, but that was also a pretty prevalent, cult during that era. And as one of my interviewees tells me in the book, with Satanism, you could kind of dabble. You can dabble in that, and it wasn't something that was very heavy. But Scientology, you had to pay, and you had to pay, and you had to pay, to try to achieve the top, the hierarchy, and there was something a lot more menacing, I think, about Scientology and what they were up to. You also had S, which was another self-empowerment group, which also required you to be all in. And LaVey never fashioned the Church of Satan to be this, to be a cult, I don't believe, and to be something that you had to, deplete your finances in order to, be an established member. And he admitted he was never really good with money. He always had he had the perception of wealth without being wealth. He had the perception of power without maybe being very powerful. So it was all about perception to him and about just manipulating people and, being able to do these incredible publicity stunts early on to get the church attention. So a lot of it was performance art, especially in the beginning. And it just became a movement that, in the 80s came to pretty much bite him in the ass.
Yeah, can you talk about that a bit? I was born in 1971, so teenager during the whole Satanic Panic era. But, the degree to which that became a cultural phenomenon that had no basis in reality and yet, ensnared so many people and destroyed a whole lot of lives. Seeing that brought back up and seeing LaVey's, hey, not my bag, man, this isn't our world, I guess could you talk a little about revisiting that and what it was like, kind of recapturing that and comparing it with, as you do later on, the conspiratorialness of our present age and our QAnon world and everything else we're experiencing. So.
Right. Yeah. So, I wasn't too familiar with the actual ground zero of the Satanic Panic, and it was a book published in 1980 called Michelle Remembers, and it was purported to have been the repressed memories that were dredged up by a psychiatrist of a young woman from Canada, from British Columbia. Her name was Michelle Smith, and she claimed that she had been abducted by a satanic cult and tortured and, been involved in rituals involving her mother. And it was this incredibly grotesque story about this one woman's alleged abuse at the hands of Satan worshipers. And in the book, she mentions the Church of Satan. She doesn't specifically mention Anton LaVey's Anton LaVey's group, from San Francisco. She mentions it in a more generic way. But when LaVey saw this, he sued the publisher, and he lost because the court sustained that it was used in a more generic sense and didn't really refer to LaVey's group. But it tarnished his reputation for sure. And then when the McMartin preschool case came out, and that was a preschool in California where it was alleged that teachers were involved with satanic rituals with children and abused kids sexually, had them participate in pornographic movies. I mean, just crazy, crazy stuff. And a lot of that was basically drawn out of these kids by therapists and psychiatrists who were, basically manipulating what and sort of adding into the kids' brains these absurd, crazy stories. Yeah. And that became kind of an epidemic that happened throughout the country when all these kids alleging satanic abuse. And that became, the Satanic Panic. And then, people were looking at rock and roll lyrics for, backward masking, Hail Satan, Satan is great. They were also looking at games like Dungeons and Dragons, which were purported to be,
gateways into Satanism.
Leading to Satanism. So LaVey, he kind of shrugged. He's like, he kind of felt, this is not my thing. This is not LaVeyan Satanism. This is crazy. This is the occultniks, what he called people who were really into this stuff and who actually worship the devil. And he also thought these were just like kids, or young adults, just getting their kicks and just being evil, being nasty people. So he wanted no part of it. So he kind of went into retreat and had his daughter Xena go out on talk shows, Sally Jesse Raphael and Ted Koppel, and try to defend the church. And she did an admirable job for someone who was in a no-win situation. She also appeared on a famous Geraldo Rivera special from that period. And that was like the Church of Satan's biggest audience, biggest mainstream audience in its entire history. There were like 20 million people who watched that show. But yeah, so he got caught up in that, no fault of his, I believe, and it kind of stuck with him. So he became the face of Satanism in the country in a way.
Yeah, it really was. The way you frame it in the book, it becomes so impossible of a situation for him. There's no way he can get out in front of it exactly. And even as you have a story in there with someone basically asking a kid, if you were raised or abducted and raised in LaVey's house, what color was it? And they come up with white instead of the exact opposite, which everybody knows about the house. It just tells you how fictive the whole thing is, but it was a believe all children era at that point. Yeah, it was a disheartening part of the book to read, but obviously essential. What's interesting to me is his the resurgence, which is when you first fall into that world. Also, that the way LaVey gets rediscovered through that punk zine world and the greater understanding of influence, I guess. The treating of it less literally and more, again, as an aesthetic and cultural approach to the world. I don't know. I found that part absolutely fascinating. But that's part of what I do with this show, I think, on a regular basis. Basically, if podcasts were around in the 1990s, this would have been, the zine thing. The one thing I'm right. also curious about, we were talking about the approach to manipulation and the self-indulgence or self-centeredness of the philosophy. You go pretty heavy into we'll say the slide into fascism or fascism adjacentness of LaVey and the people who follow him. Always there throughout his philosophy, or a hustle, or something that got more drastic as well. Go on. Yeah.
Oh, well, so even in the early days, and so let's back up a minute. So
yeah, you'll do a better job explaining it than I will. So, yeah.
Yeah. So LaVey was born Jewish. Both sets of parents were Jewish. He was born in Chicago in 1930, and he rejected all religion, Christianity, Judaism. He just thought that it was fairy tales. So the Church of Satan was an atheistic religion. They didn't believe in any god or any devil. They did see Satan as a kind of metaphorical figure that he could base this movement around. Satan being sort of the embodiment of man's brutality, carnality. It just kind of made a cool figure to be the center of the church. Early on, he was quite fascinated with the military. Even as a kid, he was fascinated during World War II with what was going on and the battles and the military strategy. And part of the appeal to him was how the Nazis were able to control a group of people, control their people, convince other Germans that what they were doing was righteous, the whole strength through joy movement. And LaVey saw all this stuff. He was fascinated by it. He saw, the Nazi flag, the swastika, as a symbol of power, which it could be argued it was a terrible symbol, but it was a symbol of power nonetheless. And, he was interviewed early on by Newsweek magazine. Nicholas Kazan was the interviewer. He's gone on to become a very popular screenwriter. He wrote Reversal of Fortune.
Oh, God. Yeah, I remember
about Klaus von Bülow and Alan Dershowitz. So anyway, Kazan went to the church to interview LaVey, and when he interviewed him, LaVey had a Nazi flag on his desk, or swastika flag on his desk. So, that was apparent early on. There was the use of those kinds of symbols within the church, and LaVey was always fascinated by Nazis and Nazi adjacent characters. In fact, in the dedication to his first book, The Satanic Bible, and The Satanic Rituals, his third book, which is kind of a companion piece, there are many names that he lists, people like W.C. Fields and P.T. Barnum and Houdini, but he also lists, all these Nazi adjacent characters, these Germans who, were Hitler's mentors during the war. So there was that real dark side to the church, even that early. And then later on, when he was kind of received by the punk rock crowd, it was kind of the nihilistic version of the punk rockers. And many of those characters played with the kind of personas that LaVey was forming for himself in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of them were pranksters. And I can name them, and they're named in the book. Yeah. People like Boyd Rice and Nicholas Schreck and Adam Parfrey, who was a publisher who published a lot of LaVey's work early on. And they were kind of pranksters. They were provocateurs. They were trying to,
be trolls.
Maybe they were kind of like edgelords or trolls back in the day. And they really pushed the limits of what was, kind of accessible or acceptable public discourse back then. But I interviewed Nicholas Schreck, who was also LaVey's son-in-law. He was married to Zena for a period, and he told me that he was not a troll. He believed in what he said, and he has said a lot of very, provocative. Controversial things. And he says, I stand by what I said. I believe that. And if I was a little too, if I came off a little harsh, it was to shock people. I want to shock people out of their complacency. So, at the same time, during that period, there were a lot of these zines that were kind of promoting this very, shocking, controversial agenda.
Yeah. And you brought up Answer Me. That was one of those. Oh my God. Yeah. I'm flashing back to my college and grad school years and remembering how, we'll say controversial, or problematic now.
Problematic,
yeah.
yes. Yeah, Answer Me was a zine back in the day, published and edited by this guy Jim Goad and his wife, and Jim is another one of those kinds of just nasty characters who, I mean, the zine was incredibly funny and witty and really well put together, but a lot of the stuff in there was like breathtaking in its viciousness.
Yeah. So did LaVey believe, and does it matter? You bring up the hucksterism a lot from everyone else's quotes about him a lot, but what did you come away with in terms of, who he was in relation to what the church was?
Yeah, a lot of the people I spoke to, especially those in the later days who knew him, who were friendly with him. A lot of young people were friendly with him in the 90s because he liked to entertain them and he liked to be entertained by them. He liked the younger generation sort of sitting at his feet and wanting to hear his wisdom. So we had a lot of people over the house, and a lot of those people told me they knew right away that he was a huckster. He didn't believe in any of this. He was in it for the money, which was not a lot of money, but he was in it for the money. So they told me this. And then some people early on who knew him also told me they thought he was kind of a huckster or a carny. But then, there was a piece that came out in the Washington Post in 1982 by this guy, Walt Harrington. And I interviewed Walt for the book. And his whole piece is about this guy who was a carny and a huckster who started this religion, who sort of came to believe what he was preaching. He told Harrington that he was so angry one day that he believed he caused an earthquake in Mexico. He was so angry another day that he believed he caused a man to shoot up a McDonald's, killing a bunch of people. This is what he told a journalist from the Washington Post. Whether or not he was still blowing smoke, Walt, the writer, told me that he thought that he was being genuine and he was questioning whether this thing that he started actually kind of became this thing he couldn't control. And he was, started believing things that he probably would not have believed, 10, 20 years earlier. So I'm inclined to think that a lot of it was performance art, but there was also genuine feeling behind the philosophy, and there was a genuine attempt to form this movement or form this group that would take his philosophy seriously and use it to better themselves.
Yeah, I'll say what it reminded me of earlier this summer or this year. I visited Joe Coleman up in New York State, and I know he gets cited in the book as sort of one of those figures who came into resurgence around the same time through the zine culture into the 90s. And being in his home with him and his wife, there was this sense of people who bring a different world into our own world, like not just in the artwork that they're making, but the environment and the life and the aesthetic that they've built is somehow like a different plane that's sort of, interacting with ours. I know it sounds weird and mystical and such, but it was one of those, those guys are living something very different than we're living. It's like when I interviewed Jim Woodring many years ago and had the instance where I realized, he sees things on a different level than we do as normal human beings, and how rare that is, I guess, in the people we encounter. Anyway, just prattling on in that respect. But your book, the sense of whether LaVey, we'll say, bought in, felt very much of a piece with my experience with Joe, and then Yeah. Anyway,
yeah. And it's funny you say that, because that was one of LaVey's, that was one of the things I really admire about this guy. That he lived his aesthetic. He called it a total environment. Yeah. He created this world around him, a professional world and a domestic world or domestic life around him that was his creation. He lived in what essentially looked like a haunted house, inside and out. He was obsessed with film noir and Universal monsters and pulp fiction of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. And he, early on, he wore a cape and a priest's collar. So he lived it. And the one analogy that I make is with the band The Cramps, because whenever I saw Lux Interior and Ivy Warshak's home life, they lived in this kind of rockabilly, tiki, horror movie, trash culture environment. So they lived their life and the domestic life and professional life kind of merged. And I always admire, and that sounds like kind of like what Joe Coleman's life was. And I always admire people who can be all in like that and take that risk and be kind of like outliers, but at the same time, they're true to their personas and true nature. And there's something really appealing about that. I couldn't do it. Maybe I'm too square, but I admire people who are able to live like that.
Yeah, it's that sense of, I'll say, totally buying in, or just not having the same, perceptual framework as the rest of us. I will say the funniest part of the book to me, among several, was the idea that he and his wife were taking one of their young acolytes to Olive Garden on a regular basis. Because of the Dan Clowes Ghost World comic, where the two Satanists are in the supermarket buying Lunchables, and it's just, I had that exact vibe. But yeah, that sense that it still had a day-to-day world to live in. But
yeah, and that was something that I wanted to get across in the book. It was a tricky book to write tonally, because I didn't want it to be this dreary, just the facts biography, because he was a very colorful character, and I wanted to approach it from a accessible, fun.
It's a very conversational voice direction that you use in the book. It's a fun, sorry, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that was my goal. That's how I wanted to write it. I didn't want to write a stuffy, formal biography. I wanted to write something that maybe LaVey would have appreciated. So there is a lot of humor in the book, but there's a lot of real dark, icky stuff in the book as well. The one bit about the Olive Garden I discovered while reading a zine from the 90s called Ben is Dead, and they talk about LaVey taking them to an Olive Garden. And then in one of my interviews with one of his, with two of my interviews with two of his friends in the 90s, they both told me about the Olive Garden. He just loved, he loved what he loved. And at one point, one of the people I interviewed, this guy, Greg Turkington, who is an actor, and he's a comedian better known as Neil Hamburger. Well, Greg was a friend of LaVey's back in the day and put out some recordings by him on his indie record label. He also edited one of LaVey's books called Satan Speaks. And, Greg told me this was just a really funny old man that he enjoyed hanging out with. And, he liked going to places like Olive Garden. And one day, Greg told him about a kind of a proto Uber Eats called Dine911.com. And it's basically this place you could go online and find menus from all your local restaurants. So he thought the idea of being able to order stuff online and have it delivered to your home, and this is in the 90s, was a spectacular invention, this thing that will change humanity, and obviously it did.
Yeah.
So,
and it had to start in San Francisco.
But no, he was fascinated by the idea that you can order food online and it comes home to you. So anyway,
so I will ask, when we talk about the fun of writing this, you come from, as you said, an entertainment writing and editing background. Was the Sammy Davis chapter the most fun to write?
It was one of the most fun, only because, I was able to do a deeper dive than I had ever imagined before. Sammy was involved he claimed to be involved in Satanism in the late 60s and went to satanic orgies. And, he also claimed that people like Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate and the Polanski crowd, they were all kind of on the edges of Satanism as well. Mm-hmm. And then in 1973, he made a TV pilot, kind of a 90-minute pilot for a series called Poor Devil, and it starred Jack Klugman and Christopher Lee and Sammy. And when the church saw the film, they thought it was a great advertisement for the Church of Satan. So LaVey awarded Sammy an honorary warlock certificate, and Sammy was quite proud of that. And he also got a Baphomet pendant that he wore around his neck. And the Baphomet was the inverted pentagram with the goat's head on it, which was kind of the brand, the logo of the Church of Satan. And Sammy was an experimenter, and he loved meeting new people, getting into new things, trying everything once was kind of his philosophy. And I actually spoke with his publicist from that era, who was basically telling me that, LaVey and his group were nothing to Sammy. They were just silly people. I remember this. It was a big nothing burger. His involvement with the Church of Satan. So even now he was downplaying Sammy's involvement in the church. But then, and this came up randomly while I was watching the Jerry Seinfeld show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. He had Eddie Murphy on, and Eddie Murphy was talking about Sammy Davis Jr. and said something to Jerry, yes, Sammy was really into the devil. He really believed in the devil. So it was a fun chapter that to put together, of course, but it also, made me think like, wow, maybe Sammy was into this stuff after all.
Yeah, at a minimum, like the way you show how various Hollywood figures were, at least, like you say, adjacent to it, just looking at this as something other than, what they were raised with and what we're accustomed to. If it's an inversion of it, that's still some other way of approaching the world. It captures that 60s into 70s vibe really well, and seeing how Hollywood kind of glums onto these things and tries to either popularize them or kind of turn them into a mainstream phenomenon is, again, it's always fascinating to watch. I'll say one of the weirder things, I think you have a list of people who LaVey considered satanic in, I assume, a more philosophical way, and included Edward Hopper in that list, which I thought, okay, I'll ask. Is that a
yeah?
Anything you have any insight into?
I think with LaVey, it was like everything that I like is satanic.
I kind of figured.
Yeah. So like H.P. Lovecraft, he's satanic. I think it was just his label on stuff that was cool. Yeah. Cool to him.
Gotcha. I should also ask about Michael Aquino, or is it Aquino or Aquino?
I think it's Aquino. Yeah. The
schism between him. He was a younger figure in the church who ended up splitting and starting his own one. First reminded me incredibly of Masters of Atlantis, the novel by Charles Portis, which if you haven't read it, I hope you do after this. About a Midwestern cult that forms and ends up having these crazy schisms over years. It's a phenomenal novel and a very strange one, but that sense of the church as, we'll say, an institution versus a mindset. You know, like it's one thing when it's like you say, it wasn't about the money, because there wasn't that much money in it, but there was still a sense of it as an institution or something that had a legacy in itself, that, you know, Aquino expected he was going to be the inheritor of the throne, as it were.
Yeah. So Aquino was an early, sort of an early adopter. He came to the church in the early 70s, and he was all in. Yeah. And he was a true believer. And that's the thing about the Church of Satan. It not only attracted these people who are into it for the kind of, like, you know,
hedonistic
the kinky
thing.
kicks,
yeah.
but also people who really believed in the devil and worshiped the devil. And Aquino came to become one of those types, which LaVey kind of, you know, frowned upon. He called them occultniks. They were the people who took this stuff way too seriously. And at some point, LaVey decided that he wanted to start selling degrees, the high degrees, the warlock and witch degrees, for the church. He thought that could benefit the church. But Aquino's whole thing was, well, you know, all these people who have gone through the ranks and proven themselves to be worthy of these degrees, it's a slap in the face to them. These people are cutting the line. But LaVey didn't appreciate resistance or confrontation, so he just let him go. Basically, Aquino said, well, I'm leaving. I'm bringing some of the higher ups from the church with me. I'm going to start my own thing. And LaVey said, you know, go ahead and do it. So they did. And Aquino created this organization, or this religion, called the Temple of Set, which basically worshipped the Egyptian version of Satan, which was called Set. And that created a schism in the church. And LaVey never really got his footing after that, because Aquino was a good administrator, and he was a very good writer, and he was a very good publicist for the church. But he did not like the direction LaVey was taking it, and LaVey was like, okay, then
do
leave.
your thing. Yeah, that's the
do your thing.
To me, that's the tension, you know, underlying the book, is the sense of actually running something as opposed to, you know, to thinking of it and living the life. There's still a sense of, you know, the administration that goes underneath. And when you show after his death, we'll say the predators and the rats and everything just coming in to scavenge everything that remains. It was,
yeah,
awful.
And it's funny because one of the big eureka moments I had during the research was I came across a research library, an occult research library in California, right outside of Berkeley, called the Adocentin Research Library. And the man who runs it, a guy named Don Frew, was a friend of LaVey's, and I interviewed him for the book. And he told me that he had boxes upon boxes of original correspondence that was rescued from the house when all these predators and rats started, you know, eating away at everything that was in the house when LaVey's longtime companion was evicted. And stuff began getting moved out of the house in a very disorganized fashion. So anyway, so he had boxes upon boxes of correspondence, both personal, administrative, and there were orders for merchandise for the Church of Satan. There were letters from people wanting to join the Church of Satan, and this all dates back to the earliest days of the church. And so I went there. I spent a few days there just scanning document after document, letter after letter. And it was a very fruitful visit, and it was extremely helpful for the book. But just seeing the real artifacts, the real contemporaneous letters, it was just a miracle to me. To this stuff still exists, and there was a lot of paper. There was a lot of newsletters. They had a newsletter called the Clove and Hoof that
yeah.
Michael Aquino actually wrote quite a bit for and was an editor of, and he was a very articulate, eloquent writer. And just seeing all of LaVey's correspondence with his friends, with admirers, with family members was just a blast.
Yeah, I always run into this with people doing research, that there's so much that's not digital, that it really is that Robert Caro, turn every page thing, but you have to, again, like I mentioned earlier, do that legwork and actually get out and not just look at things on a screen. So yeah, it's a comprehensive book, despite being, I think, 300 pages or so in the regular text before the notes.
Right.
But yeah, I think you did a marvelous job putting together, like I say, the life, the impact, the culture, and the time around him. It's to me a fantastic project. I should ask, without jinxing anything, next book?
I have no idea. I have to say this one took a lot out of me because it was done in a very short period of time.
You get that across in the interviews thing near the end. You mentioned it's only about a 2-year stretch or less than that.
Yeah, it was a little bit less than 2 years working on the book. So yeah, it took, and I have a full-time job as an editor at the Toronto Star. So I essentially had 2 full-time jobs for the past 2 years. So I need a break, but I do have ideas.
Don't share anything. It's better than that, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, something will come to me, and I'll be in the mindset to tackle another book. But right now it's just catching up on Ozark and all these TV shows I've neglected all these years.
Yeah, it's funny. I had I'm blanking on his name now. Thompson, the great TV critic, David Thompson, who praising Ozark to the heavens, and I know I need to sit down and finally watch this show, but we find excuses for other things to occupy our time. But
it's good. Yeah. I'll say that. It's good.
So let me ask, we talked about it during the break before when we weren't recording. What do you want younger readers to get from the book, from LaVey's life, given that that there was a surge of interest in him in the 90s, it carried into the aughts, and there was the Marilyn Manson influence on top of all that. But for someone who's we'll say younger, like in their 20s, I don't mean middle age or young kids, what do you want them to understand or to get from Born with a Tale?
Well, I if anything, I think the book shows at least a sliver of what the true man was like. He's the kind of guy who, if people know of him, they see him, he's this vision. He's this, the guy who looks like Ming the Merciless, and he has represented Satanism for all these years. And he's kind of this archetype. And I hope with the book I'm able to humanize him a little bit and bring him down to earth, and to show people that he was a very complicated, complex individual. I mean, people are not all bad. People can have badness in them, do bad things, but be also essentially a fascinating person. And I just find him to be a fascinating guy with this rich history. And so many people told me during my interviews, like, this guy was so interesting and so bizarre, excuse me, and so strange. Like, why did he have to lie about so much stuff in his background? He already is fascinating. And I understand that, but I also feel like the fabrications and the mythology is a big part of his appeal. The fact that this guy, said a lot of this stuff, a lot of it is frankly unprovable at this time, because he can claim something happened in his teenage years that nobody can actually research. Sure. So there are still a lot of question marks. I don't want to say that he was the consummate BS artist, because he wasn't. There are still question marks to his history, but I just hope people can revisit him or discover him through the book and just see this entertaining, scary, intelligent, fascinating guy for who he was.
Yeah, I think he did a phenomenal job of doing that. We didn't even go into the carny upbringing, the keyboard playing that he would entertain people with for hours on end, and all the other non-Satanism stuff that helps, really create this, well, like you say, a really human figure at the center of, what could be an easy to caricature person.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I want to thank you, Doug. A fantastic book. I had no idea what to expect. Dean Haspiel was the person who connected us, and Dean's got pretty good radar for who's going to make a good guest for the show. But, when this one came over, I was like, Anton LaVey? Sure. I want to find out, and found so much more. And of course, get a Joe Coleman reference in there, as well as Carl Abramson, who is married to one of my past guests, Vanessa Sinclair. So I was glad when he popped up around the 200s or so in the book. It was sort of bringing it together.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a lot of connections with you. Oh,
God. You do this long enough. It's the same thing in the editorial world. You keep going, and it turns out you build a lot of connections and friends over the years. But again, thank you for this. And, I am looking forward to what comes next, but I'm awfully happy that you made this for us. So, Doug, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Thanks so much, Gil. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me. This is a blast.
And that was Doug Broad. Go get his new book, Born with a Tale, The Devilish Life and Wicked Times of Anton Szandor LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan. It's out now from Hachette, and it's an entertaining, informative read about a fascinating American figure. I mean, there's so much going on in this book that's bigger than just LaVey, but it's, well, you'll see. I really hope you give it a shot. I also want to check out Doug's first book. They just seem a little weird. That one about Kiss, Cheap Trick, Aerosmith, and Stars. Because, well, I was born in 1971, and this was the background music of my childhood into my teen years. So you should give that one a look, too. Now, Doug does not have a website. Looks like his only social media is Instagram at doug.broad. That's DOUG.BROD. The Church of Satan is online at churchofsatan.com, all one word. They're on Twitter as Church of Satan, too. That's all one word. That account looks fun. I checked it out through my work Twitter account. I no longer have a personal one. Otherwise, I'd follow them. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with fascinating conversations with all sorts of interesting cultural folks. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition, whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me an email, DM if we're connected on Instagram or Blue Sky, postcard or letter. My mailing address is at the bottom of the newsletter that I send out twice a week. That is buttondown.email/VMSpod. You should sign up for that. Or you can leave a message on my Google Voice number. That's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So you go longer than that, just call back, leave another message. And let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I'd never run something like that without the speaker's permission. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I'm going to ask you for money at the end of the year when I do a Kickstarter for the book that I'm making, but really give to people, give to institutions in need. With people, you can go through like GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding platforms where you'll find people who need help, making rent, medical bills, car payments, veterinary bills, getting an artistic project going, all sorts of stuff. Or you may just want to support the work that they do. The people are a lot of people are in a position where a couple of dollars might make a real difference in their lives. So, try to give. Now, with institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month. I make election contributions, but, that's partly because I'm a lobbyist. We are right now 2 weeks away from the 2024 presidential elections and the other elections. We'll see how that all goes. But anyway, there are all sorts of institutions you can give to. Besides that stuff, there is the Poor People's Campaign, Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice, Freedom Funds. What I'm saying is, if you got a few dollars to spare, you can really help make a difference in the world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.